Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment, for the Sony 12-24mm f2.8 G Master lens. At roughly $3,000 US, this is the most expensive wide-angle zoom lens that Sony has ever made, but also arguably the best they've ever made. Now, whether or not it's right for you is an entirely different question. I'll start off by saying that both in still and video, this lens has been fantastic. Now, I'm a little bit partial because I love to shoot wide, so this is somewhat of a dream lens for me. But that doesn't mean that I live in the dream world. At $3,000, the first question I had to personally tackle was, in spite of the fact that it produces amazing results when paired with my A7R4, A7R2, or even the little old A6500, I had to decide whether or not it was actually worth the amount of money that it sells for. So the first point of reference of comparison is the F4 version of this piece of glass, which suffers from some of the same issues this does. And when I say issues, this isn't a perfect lens, but boy, is it close. So those issues are the fixed hood lens, it is attached, there's no way to take it off, and then how much that front element protrudes. You're not going to be able to put on any filters natively. This is the same problem, as I just stated, that the older F4 G series version of this glass has. And that lens sells now for, I think, around $1,750, somewhere in that area. So it's a little bit more than half the price of this piece of glass. So that's the first thing to tackle. Now, for me, in my own experience, granted, this is the better lens, I personally cannot justify it with nearly twice the price. Now, that's not to say there won't be some of you out there, or many of you out there, that will be able to justify it or will not care about the price difference. They will only care that it outperforms it. But the margin that it outperforms it by is not huge. After all, I did review that lens last year. I loved it, and the only reason I didn't run out and purchase it is because I knew this was on the roadmap. And before I would spend fresh money on that 12-24 f4, I had to see what this was like. And I can say after using it, while this is worth $3,000, for me personally, I would rather go with the lighter, even if it has slightly less fidelity and a little bit more distortion than this lens, I would rather save the money and go with the F4 G series version. It's also lighter than this lens, and I'm not complaining about its weight because the overall build quality on this is fantastic, as you would expect from a G Master piece of glass. But at the end of the day, for me personally, again, I don't see twice the performance in order, to basically justify twice the price, and that is roughly what it is. Now, let's talk about other options, because even though the F4 G series lens that preceded it is the most obvious comparison because it's the only one that matches the literal 12-24 range, it isn't your only option, right? And that's another part of how I look at this, and that's why I'm mentioning it. You may have noticed I've got my Sony 16-35 f4 lens on the right. I've got my even older APS-C 10-18mm lens on the left. And I have to say, both of them are fantastic pieces of glass. Do they compare to this? No. But this can fit in my pocket. This works both on APS-C and full frame. And if you're getting confused by that, of course, full frame FE lenses work natively on APS-C and full frame cameras, but APS-C lenses generally do not. But when this was made, for those of you unfamiliar, when the 10-18 came out, it oddly enough, worked on full-frame cameras. Granted, in a very limited capacity, but it still functioned. And that's part of the reason I've kept it, because it's the only lens of its kind on this planet that works both on my APS-C cameras and full-frame, has this form factor, which means I can actually fit it in my pocket on smaller bodies like the A6500. Granted, APS-C cameras these days from Sony have only gotten larger, but that's part of the reason that the 10-18 still commands top dollar, whereas most glass, it holds its value, but it still depreciates. This little guy, on the other hand, has held firm for a reason. No other manufacturer has as high a quality, as small a form factor 10 to 18 on Earth that I'm aware of, that I've ever touched specifically. Now, if you're thinking about 16 to 35 range, you've got, of course, the Sony I have here or the G Master to consider. Both are really good lenses with very different price points. Here you're spending a little over $1,000, great build quality, not a perfect piece of glass, but still very good throughout its entire range. If you need that F2.8, then you're going to step to the G Master, which is heavier. I'm not going to say better construction because basically Sony moved from all metal construction with early lenses like this to what you have now with G Master, where it's a combination of different materials, which isn't a bad thing. I happen to think that the design language and the overall look and feel of the G Master lenses is better than the old all-metal Sony, which was the best back then, the Zeiss Sony glass. But again, you're in that same position. Does the F2.8 G Master, which sells for basically double what this old lens, is it worth that extra money? Now, I would argue it is. You know, if like me, you already own this, it's hard to justify that transition. In fact, I couldn't because of lenses like Sony's recent release, the 20mm. Now, granted, that's a fixed lens, but the 20mm G lens is so good, and it's under $1,000 that I said to myself, if I really want a brand new, high-quality, wide-angle, I'm going to grab that, and that'll be more complimentary than moving from the 16 to 35 f4 to the 16 to 35 f2.8 G Master. So this is, again, my thinking, my thought process on what makes sense in my bag lineup of glass that I use regularly. So, and that's, again, if you're willing to step out of the 12 to 24 range, because there isn't anything else to match it, as I've stated. I mean, Sigma, close at a 14mm starting point, and it's only, I think, 1,400 and change, maybe it's 1,500. I haven't reviewed the Sigma. Maybe Sigma will send it over, and I can then give you my opinion on where it ranks in comparison with this. But I have to imagine that even though the Sigma is supposed to be as fast as this glass, it's probably going to compare more favorably to the older F4 12 to 24 G series than the G Master. But again, I haven't had it to use it to really compare it, so I'm not putting weight in what I just said. Again, that's just what I imagine. But when you're talking about, again, the zoom lenses, you know, if you're thinking about this, I would sooner opt for the 16 to 35 G Master. Again, you're going to save a lot of money and you're going to have amazing performance in a wider range. You know, so that to me is a more versatile lens. But that brings me back to where I started, which is that if you need a 12 to 24mm piece of glass like this, there really isn't much of a discussion to be had. Because if you want to take landscape shots, architectural shots, real estate related shots, and we're talking about still or video, you know, that extra few or 4mm of wider capability is pretty much priceless. And there are a lot of people out there that are saying, oh, it's only 2mm, it's only 4mm. Why spend all that money? Why deal with the front lens protruding, you know, the fixed hood? Well, it's because this is an incredibly unique piece of glass that, as I've stated through the course of this video, is relatively unmatched. And that's why I was worried, which often happens when Sony sends me brand new glass like this, I was worried I was going to fall in love with it. Because boy, does that happen. And as I stated, the only reason I didn't fall in love with the F4 version is because I knew this was coming. Because when I reviewed the F4 version, it had been out for several years. And the F4 version is fairly old at this point. And, you know, this leads a lot of people to believe, well, this has been designed for the higher resolution sensors. And there is some truth to that, no question. Some truth. But don't fool yourself. As I've stated, you know, the F4 version of this lens is very good. It's not as good as this one, and it better not be, considering its price point, right? I mean, that would just be ridiculous. But as I've stated, if budget is not an issue and you know you need this range, you're just not going to beat it. Now, if you're willing to give up 2 to 4mm of reach, well, not reach, but in terms of the widest angle, then you've got a lot of options. As I stated, you have the Sigma, you have the two Sony 16 to 35s. And I'm including this not just because I have it, but because realistically, this does do a fairly good job at 16 millimeters at f4. It is no slouch. And then if you are willing to go to something that's, besides the G Master version of this lens, which is exceptional, arguably, I think, the most popular lens in Sony's entire lineup, you've got that 20 millimeter prime G glass now that is under $1,000 that gives you results and has build quality like it is in the G Master lineup. So at the end of the day, the good news is you have a lot of options. The bad news is if you need 12 millimeters, you really only have two, which is what you're looking at here and the f4 version. And for me, as I said at the beginning of this video, I personally, because of my needs, because I don't have to have f2.8, while I would love to have it, I would personally go with the less expensive f4 G series lens. But if I was shooting on assignment and I knew that I needed 12 millimeters, then $3,000 is not, it's an expensive price to pay, but it's an investment. You know, this is not something you're going to be upgrading every year or even every several years. I don't see this lens likely getting replaced for at least 5 years down the roadmap, if even. And that's because from what I've seen, again, just an exceptional piece of glass. And the only downsides I've already mentioned. You know, I really don't think that its weight is going to be a problem for most users. And I don't think having the protruding front element and fixed hood are a big deal. Of course, it has its own custom cap, which locks on, and you're going to need that. If you lose it, it's going to be an expensive little replacement. I did not look to see what it costs, but you can't just run out and buy a generic cap for this. I'm sure you could find something. You know, eventually B&H, Adorama, they'll have something. Amazon will have something. China will have made something if it doesn't already exist. But as it stands right now, this will be an expensive little piece to replace if you lose it. So keep that in mind. But overall, my experience, my 2 weeks that I had with this loaner from Sony, exceptional. I really have nothing bad to say about it. It's just so expensive, and we're at a point in Sony's maturation as a, top of the line digital imaging company, if not the best in my opinion, that we have a lot of good options. And that's why I just brought out my current options. And the 16 to 35, again, it's old, it's not so expensive, a little over $1,000, completely competent. But as I've stated over and over, if you need a wider frame, you've got to look at this. And this little guy, yeah, it may not compete with any of the big boys, but it's not meant to. It's an APS-C lens that magically works on both APS-C and full frame, even though it wasn't supposed to. And again, it stays in my lineup because it's a go anywhere without any weight, any compromise sort of piece of glass. Of course, it's not distortion free, but you can address, as I've stated, most of those things in post. And that's the beauty of most of these lenses. So overall, again, price is high, build quality is excellent, performance is excellent to match, and it really just comes down to whether or not you think it's worth the $3,000. And hopefully this video and me talking about my personal experience with this lens, the f4 version of this lens, the 16 to 35 G Master, the 20 millimeter G, hopefully that helps round out what you will eventually take away from this video in making that decision for yourself. So I don't think you'll have regrets about this, but God knows you got a lot of options without having to spend the $3,000 that this lens commands. And I believe that this ultimately is a niche lens designed, as I stated, for a very specific group of photographers, and you know who you are, professional and non, that love shooting landscape, love shooting architectural shots, and I don't mean architectural details. Granted, you can get details if you have a high enough res sensor like this, which is part of the reason I love this pairing, is that I could just walk around at 12 to 14 millimeters and I am not going to miss a beat. That's part of what I love about it. But I can do that with the f4 version. Won't be as good, but it'll be damn close. And that rounds things out. Really nothing to dislike about this lens other than its price. And well, anyone who owns gear like this already knows that's just part of the game. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe and please stay safe. Later.